Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to the newspaper review. I am Kasituni and I'll be taking you through this segment. Now let's take a look at the top stories making headlines this hour. First, we'll start with the Daily Trust. Boldly written, ADC presidential primaries. Atiku, Amechi, Hayatuddin battle for tickets. You get that on page 3 and page 4 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 19, Nigeria remains World Bank's third largest borrower with $18.5 billion. Still in the same newspaper on page 19 as well. Disruptions loom as NCAA places airlines on no service order. Still at the top of the newspaper, commuters spend hours on Abuja-Kaduna Highway. At the bottom of the newspaper on the APC primaries, governors outdo one another as Tinubu nets over 10 million votes. You get that on page 5 and page 6 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the First Daily. Boldly written, blood on the altar. Gunmen killed worshippers. Adopt 15 in fresh Kwara horror. At the top of the newspaper, ADC clears Atiku, Amechi, Hayatuddin for presidential race. Still in the same newspaper on politics, Malami emerges ADC consensus governorship candidate in Kebbi. U.S. Embassy, Lagos Consulate shut Monday for Memorial Day. Still in the same newspaper, Syrup demands name behind $460 million Abuja CCTV contract. Still in the same newspaper on politics as well, Tinubu clinches APC presidential ticket, receives certificate of return. NDLEA arrests Chinese woman over 2.1 billion naira drug shipment. At the bottom of the newspaper, NCAA sanctions 11 airlines over unpaid charges. Moving away from that newspaper to the leadership. Boldly written, Tinubu wins APC primary with 10.9 million votes. Says rivals lack alternative vision. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Then on page 9 of the newspaper, Senator King Jibe says others attacked during ADC primary. At the top of the newspaper, NCAA suspends services to Air Peace, Ibom, Value Jet, Cavantun. 7 others over death. You get the full story on page 17 of the newspaper. Then on page 35 of the newspaper on politics, Atiku, Amechi, Hayatuddin vied for ADC presidential ticket today. Still in the same newspaper on APC primaries, wave of resignations hits Bauchi APC over alleged candidate imposition. You get the full story on page 35 of the newspaper. Then on page 9 of the newspaper, cooking gas prices soars again, hits 2,000 naira per kilo. Still in the same newspaper, Nigeria at high risk of Ebola importation. Coming from the NCDC, you get the full story on page 31 of the newspaper. Then on page 29 of the newspaper, Niger seeks partnership with firm on gold refinery. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on page 28, bandit killed 3 church worshippers, adopt 15 in Kwara. That's a very sad story. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. Boldly written, we won't allow opposition to drag Nigeria back. Tinubu vows. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper, S&P, Dangote Refinery driving Nigeria's economy resurgence. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, troops rescue 92 kidnapped victims. Void terrorist IED ambush in Borno. You get the full story on page 5 of the newspaper. Then on page 5 of the newspaper as well, ICJ advisory opinion on strike does not supersede Nigeria's labor law, coming from the NECA. Then NAPTEP extends 2026 NCEE registration, shifts exam to June 13. You get the full story on page 5 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, NCDC intensifies surveillance preparedness against Ebola. You get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Matrix, boldly written on 2027 politics. I'll protect Nigerians, restore peace, Tinubu vows. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper on page 3, Nigeria risks economic collapse if fuel imports continue. CPPE fires warning. Still in the same newspaper on politics, fresh crisis rocks ADC as new faction sacks David Mark's leadership. You get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, at President Wadagi's inauguration, federal government pushes deep Nigeria-Benin ties. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, $460 million Abuja CCTV project. SIRAP demands list of contractors, other beneficiaries. Then on page 23 of the newspaper, coming from Bukky Wright, how my children were taken from me at a young age. Then on page 3 of the newspaper, Taylor arrested over fake bandit attack, video in Ogun. Then on sports, on page 25 of the newspaper on sports, Arsenal beats Crystal Palace, lifts EPL title. That's a huge win for Arsenal once again. Moving away from that newspaper to the Punch, boldly written 2027 race, ADC picks Tinubu's challenger today. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 7 of the newspaper at the top, APC primaries, Tinubu polls 10.9 billion votes to clinch presidential ticket. Moving away from that newspaper to the Hope, boldly written on page 3 of the newspaper, presidential race, Tinubu secures 10.99 million votes in primaries, gets APC flag. At the top of the newspaper, Shettima urges stronger Nigeria-Benin ties, deepens regional cooperation. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, still at the top, NCAA suspends services to Air Peace, Ibom Air, and 9 others over debt. Still in the same newspaper, FEMA begins safety intervention on Owo Ikare Agumba Road. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Army rescues 92 kidnapped civilians in Borno, neutralizes IEDs. You get the full story on page 4 and page 5 of the newspaper. U.S. Embassy, Lagos Consulate shut today over Memorial Day observance. You get it on page 2 of the newspaper. IGP's ban on POS services near police stations defiled. Coming from investigation, you get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, NDLEA arrests Chinese 63 with large consignment of illicit drugs. You get the full gist on page 4 of the newspaper. 3 worshippers killed, 15 adopted in fresh attack on Kwara community. You get that on page 4 and page 5 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independence, boldly written on page 29, economic reforms alone won't spark private sector growth. Still in the same newspaper, Tinubu pledges to deepen economic reforms, strengthen security. You get the full gist on page 29 of the newspaper. Outrage grows in Nigeria over surging digital transfer charges. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. I am Kasitoni. Many thanks for watching. Do well to join us next time for more breaking news. Do have a beautiful day.